1 minute, 5 seconds. That's all it took for Paraguay to detonate the entire narrative of the 2026 World Cup's second week. Matias Galarza connected with a low, powerful shot from distance. Almost before the whistle from the opening kickoff had finished echoing around the San Francisco Bay Area stadium, and just like that, the scoreboard read 1-0. Most fans were still finding their seats. Some were still buying overpriced drinks in the concourse. And somewhere in the press boxes, journalists were typing their match previews. None of them saw it coming. But here's the thing about this game. The goal wasn't even close to being the weirdest part of the afternoon. By the time the 90 minutes were up, Turkey had been eliminated from Group D before even playing their final group match. Paraguay had somehow held on with 10 men for the entire second half. A Paraguayan midfielder had walked into the history books for a red card nobody had ever seen before, and that same team's goal scorer had briefly become the most talked about wristwatch model in sports, all in one match. Let's go through it properly because this game has become something of a perfect lens through which to examine everything that's currently wrong, and honestly, everything that's genuinely complicated about this version of FIFA's biggest tournament. Start with the watch, because that's the moment that broke the internet before the match was even halfway done. It was the 45th minute. Tensions between Turkey and Paraguay had been simmering since the early stages. A hard foul midfield triggered one of those slow-building player confrontations where everyone gathers and nobody quite knows what to do next, and referee Ivan Barton, the Salvadoran official assigned to manage the fixture, stepped in to break up the cluster of bodies, as referees do dozens of times in any given match at this level. Somewhere in that physical shuffle, Barton's watch came clean off his wrist and landed quietly on the grass. Galarza spotted it. He picked it up, and instead of doing the obvious thing, handing it straight back to the official standing 3 feet away, he strapped it onto his own wrist and kept playing. Cameras caught the whole sequence in full detail, as cameras at a 48-team World Cup invariably do. For several minutes, the man who had scored the opening goal was walking around an international football pitch wearing the match referee's personal property, while the game continued around him. He wasn't subtle about it. He wasn't trying to hide it. He was just wearing a watch that didn't belong to him, in front of roughly 50,000 people and a global broadcast audience, seemingly because the thought of immediately returning it just hadn't occurred to him. He did give it back eventually. No fuss, no confrontation, no punishment. Barton put it back on, and the match moved on. Former German referee Patrick Ittrich, now working as a pundit for Magenta TV's World Cup coverage, was asked about the incident live on air, and visibly didn't have an answer. What's going on in a player like that, with all due respect? What's the matter with him? I don't know, he said, which is probably the most honest response available when you're being asked to explain something that has never happened before in the history of the sport at this level. And honestly, there's no sinister reading of this moment that holds up under scrutiny. Nobody has suggested Galarza was trying to steal the watch, deprive the official of a timing device, or gain any tangible advantage. The whole thing reads, by every account, as a bizarre, almost childlike impulse in the middle of a chaotic moment. Pick up the thing that fell, put it on, get distracted by the fact that you're playing a World Cup match, forget to immediately hand it back. That's probably the entire story. But here's what the moment actually reveals. Under the charm. A World Cup is broadcast from dozens of ultra-high-definition camera angles simultaneously, and any individual item on that pitch can be isolated and tracked in real time. A referee losing a watch and a player picking it up presumably happens more often than people realize in lower-profile matches where nobody has 4 cameras on every square meter of the grass. At this tournament, that 15-second curiosity became a global talking point within the hour. It exposed something else too. Nobody, not the referee, not the fourth official, not the broadcast team, and apparently not the official rulebook of association football, had a clean established protocol for what you're actually supposed to do when a player takes a referee's personal property mid-match and doesn't immediately return it. Nobody seriously thinks football needs a specific law about this, but it's a small and telling reminder that a sport played at this pace and intensity on this scale will always keep generating situations the rulebook didn't anticipate. The gap between what the laws cover and what actually happens in 90 minutes of high-stakes football is always wider than administrators want to admit. Now, here's where the match makes its second turn, and this one isn't charming at all. This one is genuinely historic, and it connects directly to one of the most politically charged regulatory decisions FIFA has made heading into this tournament. Third minute of first half stoppage time. Paraguay's Miguel Almiron becomes involved in a confrontation following another foul near midfield. He exchanges words with Turkey's right back during the altercation. And in the middle of that exchange, Almiron covers his mouth with his hand while speaking. Turkey appeals. Referee Barton goes to video review. Moments later, straight red card. It was the first time in World Cup history that a player had been sent off specifically and exclusively for covering his mouth during a confrontation. And the rule that produced that card had been on the books for exactly one World Cup. Here's the origin. In April of this year, the International Football Association Board, IFAB, the body responsible for the laws of the game, met in Vancouver and unanimously approved two new FIFA-proposed rule changes. The first, any player covering their mouth during a confrontational situation with an opponent may be sent off. The second, any player leaving the pitch in protest at a referee's decision may also be red-carded. Both rules were approved specifically for implementation at the 2026 World Cup. The mouth-covering rule traces its existence back to an incident during the Champions League season involving Real Madrid and Atletico Madrid, where a player shielding their lips during a confrontation made it impossible for officials to verify a serious allegation of discriminatory abuse. The old reality was blunt. If someone said something genuinely racist or homophobic behind a covered hand, there was no practical way to hold them accountable without lip-reading confirmation, which referees cannot be expected to provide in real time under match conditions. FIFA President Gianni Infantino made the logic explicit when he explained the rule's rationale publicly. If a player covers his mouth and says something with a discriminatory consequence, he has to be sent off, because there's otherwise no clean way to hold him accountable. The act of concealment, from FIFA's perspective, is itself the offense, regardless of what was actually said. Remove the ambiguity about whether something happened by removing the behavior that makes ambiguity possible. That's a coherent position. It is also, in Almiron's case, a position that generated a deeply uncomfortable moment because no allegation of discriminatory speech surrounded the Paraguayan's exchange with the Turkish defender. There was no suggestion, from anyone covering the match, that the words behind Almiron's hand were anything beyond a heated ordinary football argument, the kind that happens dozens of times in any given World Cup match without consequence. He covered his mouth most likely out of reflex or out of years of professional habit, without any intent to hide anything that wasn't already ordinary frustration. The rule did not care. Under the law, as written, intent is not a consideration. Content is not a consideration. The gesture alone triggers the maximum sanction available automatically, without room for the referee to weigh context or severity. Paraguay finished the first half with 10 men and a 1-goal lead that Almiron had absolutely nothing to do with losing. They held it for over 45 more minutes against a Turkish side desperate for any route back into the match and their own World Cup. Turkey couldn't find it. The score stayed 1-0. Their World Cup ended there. The Almiron case has since become the sharpest early test of whether FIFA's zero-tolerance approach to this particular rule actually holds up when it meets the messy, unscripted reality of tournament football. Critics who flagged the overcorrection problem when the rule was first announced, and there were many, pointed to exactly this scenario. What happens when the rule catches a player who clearly had nothing to conceal? The answer, it turns out, is that the rule applies anyway. The card comes out. The team plays short-handed. The result is shaped by a gesture that, in any tournament before this one, would have drawn exactly no reaction at all. And sitting above all of this is a broader, much more uncomfortable conversation about who is actually running FIFA right now and whose interests the organization is genuinely serving. Gianni Infantino has been FIFA's president since 2016, when he stepped into the wreckage of one of the worst corruption scandals in the history of international sports governance. The United States Department of Justice had indicted dozens of football officials on charges related to bribery, wire fraud, and racketeering, a sprawling operation so deep and so long-running that it became shorthand for everything people suspected about FIFA but had struggled to prove. Infantino arrived promising transparency, reform, and a clean break from the Blatter era. A decade later, the picture is complicated. Financial disclosures have improved. Compensation linked to historical corruption cases has exceeded $200 million. FIFA's Forward Development Program has distributed billions to member associations across Africa, Asia, and smaller federations that historically received almost nothing. Infantino was re-elected without opposition in 2023. By raw institutional metrics, the organization functions better than it did. But the political dynamics surrounding this World Cup have reopened questions about FIFA's direction that feel sharper and more pointed than at any point since Infantino took over. Start with the relationship between Infantino and President Trump. It goes back years, and it has accelerated aggressively in the lead-up to this tournament. The FIFA president has visited the White House multiple times. He co-created something called the FIFA Peace Prize and arranged for Trump to receive it at the 2025 World Cup draw in Miami, held barely a mile from the White House. He sat alongside Trump in international discussions related to the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. Former FIFA president Sepp Blatter, himself banned from international football governance and facing ongoing legal proceedings, was blunt about his read on the dynamic, telling Politico in February of this year that the organization had become what he called a dictatorship under Infantino, and that the Trump relationship represented a fundamental compromise of FIFA's stated political neutrality. From a governance standpoint, the proximity is at minimum uncomfortable. Infantino needs Trump's full cooperation to stage a tournament across 3 countries, in which the United States hosts the vast majority of matches. Trump, for his part, has made hosting this World Cup a centerpiece of his second-term image agenda. The interests align. Whether they should align in the ways they visibly do is a question that has drawn bipartisan skepticism in Washington and significant concern from human rights organizations that have monitored FIFA's governance closely since the Qatar scandal. That political alliance produced one of the tournament's ugliest pre-competition stories. Omar Abdulkader Artan, a Somali-born referee widely regarded as Africa's finest official heading into the tournament, was denied entry to the United States at Miami International Airport and sent back to Istanbul. He was traveling on a diplomatic passport. He had completed FIFA's official referee preparation program and been praised by evaluators for his consistency and decision-making. He was on FIFA's official 52-person referee list for the World Cup. None of it mattered. U.S. Customs and Border Protection turned him away, citing vetting concerns, with the specific mechanism being Trump's travel ban on Somali nationals. The Somali embassy attempted to intervene. Border control didn't budge. FIFA's official response stated plainly that host government immigration decisions are outside their jurisdiction. That statement is technically accurate and also a perfectly clean illustration of the fundamental problem. FIFA appointed Artan. FIFA cannot get Artan into the country hosting the tournament. FIFA's political relationship with the administration responsible for blocking him is too important to risk by pushing back. Ian Wright, the former England international, who has become one of football's most prominent voices, was openly furious about the episode in the British media. The incident deepened existing concerns about what happens when an organization claiming political neutrality becomes visibly dependent on one government's good favor. Then there are the hydration breaks. In theory, a thoughtful welfare measure, introduced because the summer heat across American stadiums genuinely poses risks to elite athletes performing at maximum intensity. 3-minute breaks, 1 per half, justified by climate science, endorsed by sports medicine professionals, designed to protect players. In practice, a commercial inventory injection worth an estimated $250 million across the tournament's 104 matches. FIFA quietly reached agreements with broadcasters allowing those 3-minute pauses to serve as advertising windows. An analyst at S&P Global calculated the total, 208 breaks multiplied by 3 minutes. Each produces over 10 hours of additional advertising inventory, with individual slots reportedly valued between $7 and $9 million. Top coaches, including those of major national programs, have been publicly critical. Players have expressed frustration with the rhythm disruption. Fans inside stadiums have been openly hostile, sitting through commercial blackouts while the players on the pitch hydrate in front of them. The opening match between Mexico and South Africa crystallized the controversy almost immediately. Raul Jimenez scored. Fox TV cut to an advertising block, framing it as part of the scheduled hydration break. Football fans watching at home saw a goal, then saw commercials. Critics argued that calling it a welfare measure, while simultaneously monetizing it at scale, was the oldest FIFA play in the history of the institution. Dress a revenue stream in the language of player protection, and dare anyone to argue against hydration. And then there's the criminal complaint. Michel Platini, the former UEFA president whose long legal battle with FIFA and the Swiss football establishment has become one of European football's most enduring sagas, confirmed this June, through his Paris-based legal team, that he is filing criminal proceedings against Infantino, former FIFA legal director Marco Villager, and former compliance head Domenico Scala. The complaint alleges that Infantino and the two officials orchestrated a coordinated campaign to block Platini from contesting the FIFA presidency, ensuring Infantino's path to the top job was cleared. Platini is separately seeking financial damages from FIFA itself, claiming the organization deliberately engineered his exclusion from the sporting and administrative arena he had spent his career in. Infantino has not publicly responded in detail. FIFA has not commented substantively, but the timing, criminal proceedings formally launched in the opening week of the biggest World Cup in the history of the sport, is the kind of institutional weight that doesn't disappear regardless of what happens on the pitch. Put all of it together, and the Turkey versus Paraguay match becomes something more than a football game with two unusual incidents. It becomes a microcosm of the exact tensions running through every level of this tournament. Players walking into red cards for gestures that were legal 18 months ago, under rules designed with genuinely defensible intent, but applied without any room for human judgment. A referee's watch ending up on the wrong wrist in front of a global audience because nobody anticipated needing a rule for it. A tournament president photographed laughing with the sitting American president, while Africa's top referee sits in a Turkish airport, unable to board a flight. Advertising breaks sold as player welfare disguised behind the language of heat safety. A criminal complaint filed against the FIFA president by one of the sport's most storied figures in the days before the first whistle. What's happening in San Francisco, Dallas, Kansas City, New York, and every other host city across this expanded 48-team tournament is, on one level, exactly what FIFA sells it as. The sport at its most global, its most electric, its most unpredictable. 1 minute and 5 seconds to the fastest goal of the competition. A goal scorer wearing a referee's watch. A historic red card for a gesture the game's own culture normalized for decades. But underneath the spectacle, the same structural tensions that have defined FIFA's relationship with power, money, and politics, since long before the Blatter era, are very much still present. They're just dressed differently now. The corruption scandal of the early 2000s involved wire transfers and briefcases. What's visible in 2026 involves advertising contracts, political proximity to the White House, visa bans applied to referees from sanctioned nations, and criminal complaints filed against sitting presidents. Turkey's World Cup ended on a Saturday afternoon in a Bay Area stadium. Their players had genuinely believed, heading into the tournament, that this squad had the talent to make a deep run. Many analysts agreed. They're going home with a campaign people will remember primarily through the lens of a 90-minute match that produced two moments nobody could have scripted. Paraguay, down a man for the entire second half, organized themselves with a defensive discipline that deserves far more credit than it has received in the coverage dominated by everything else the match produced. Holding a one-goal lead with 10 men against a side, with European League-level talent and genuine motivation for 45 minutes, is not easy. They did it cleanly, without drama, and without conceding a single moment where Turkey genuinely looked like scoring. They move forward in the group. Their campaign continues. And somewhere in a Paraguayan dressing room, a midfielder named Almiron is probably still coming to terms with the fact that his World Cup nearly ended for covering his mouth during an argument, and that in a different tournament, in a different year, nobody would have noticed at all. The gap between the rules as written and the game as it's actually lived hasn't closed yet, And matches like this are precisely where that gap shows up most clearly, on the biggest possible stage, in front of everybody watching at once.